Welcome to the Roy Morgan Weekly Update. Now, for the entire campaign, the LNP or coalition government, led by Scott Morrison, has trailed far behind the ALP, and last week the LNP failed to make up any ground. The RBA's decision to raise interest rates for the first time in over a decade certainly hasn't helped the Morrison government. Government confidence was down 3 points to 81, below that magical neutral 100, and consumer confidence, the ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence estimate, down a small 0.2 points to 90.5, essentially unchanged. But both of these indicators are moving in the wrong direction for the Morrison government. Now, there are many in the media these days who are talking about the comparison to the 2019 election, when there was that comeback win for the LNP. But there's a significant difference between then and now. At the same stage in 2019, the Roy Morgan poll and other polls actually had much closer. The two parties were much closer. Roy Morgan showed the ALP had a narrow lead of 2 percentage points. Within the margin of error, essentially, we had the ALP on 51, LNP on 49%. Now, the LNP over the next couple of weeks, or the last 2 weeks of the election, gained 2.5 percentage points. And if they repeated that same kind of effort this time and picked up 2.5 points, the ALP would still have a sizable victory at next week's election. So that would see the ALP at 52% and the LNP at 48%. Now, that sort of result would likely lead to an ALP minority government in a hung parliament, and that's probably the best result that the LNP coalition can realistically aim for, with early voting already beginning. In fact, some people have voted already. Summing up, if an election had been held now, the ALP would have had a clear majority, according to the Roy Morgan poll conducted in the week up to Sunday, May 8, 2022. Now, if we look at the primary vote, we see support for the two major parties remains low, although the ALP has now pulled ahead of the LNP on primary vote. The ALP's primary vote is sitting there at 35.5, up 0.5%, and the LNP on 34%, down 1% in a week. That's a gap of 1.5 points in favour of the ALP. Most importantly, when considering a hung parliament, is the continuing huge level of support for the other parties and the independents, now at 30.5%, up 0.5 on last week, but well up on last election, when the other parties and independents had around 25% of the vote. So support for the Greens we see here unchanged at 13%, other parties up 1.5% to 9%, and the independents down 1% to 8.5%. Now, we seem to be watching petrol prices quite seriously, and what we saw, petrol prices increase slightly, just over 1 cent to $1.80 per litre last week, the third straight weekly increase. And as we've seen consistently, when petrol prices go up, consumer confidence tends to fall. And again, it did, although only a little bit, by 0.2%. But of course, it isn't only the price of petrol that increased last week. Let's look at the Australian official interest rates. The higher than expected ABS inflation figure of 5.1% over the year to March 2022, that was released 2 weeks ago, but that really led to the RBA increasing interest rates up 0.25% to 0.35%. Now, that's important because this is the first time the Reserve Bank has increased official interest rates in Australia in over a decade, in fact since November 2010. And the last time the Reserve Bank increased interest rates during an election campaign was in November 2007. And the LNP government, John Howard's LNP government, lost the next election. Even though interest rates are much lower now than they were a decade ago, the important thing to consider is that household debt is much higher now. And as a result of that, we see the people most impacted by interest rate movements are that approximately 30% of the population with a mortgage. a key voting bloc in Sydney, Melbourne and other capital cities around Australia. These people did not want to see interest rates increase. They definitely didn't want to see them increase last week, and the Roy Morgan ANZ consumer confidence figures show this really clearly. So as we can see, the biggest plunge in consumer confidence over the last 2 weeks, before and after the Reserve Bank's decision to raise interest rates, was among those Australians paying off their mortgage. Their consumer confidence dropped by over 14 points. The declines for those people who own their own home or for renters was much less. Those who already own their home showed a consumer confidence drop of 3.3 points, and for renters, consumer confidence was down only 1.2 points. So this key voting bloc, who are paying off their mortgage, which includes a whole lot of young families in key seats around Australia in the so-called mortgage belt, has been a key demographic for the LNP in many of the marginal seats. This hit to their confidence right on the eve of the federal election could well be the final knockout of the LNP, making the election of a Labor government next week very likely. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to joining you next week.